Welcome to the Key of Imagination. Today we're discussing the episode Judgment Night. We'll talk about how much punishment is enough for Captain Lancer, whether Muller is a part of Lancer's recurring nightmare, and we'll even get into some Dante, Prometheus, and take a stroll through purgatory. So, grab your keys and let's open up this door to the fifth dimension.
You unlock this door with the key of imagination.
We often have this vision in our minds of the pearly gates of heaven, and how once there you'll be greeted by St. Peter and his big book of your earthly deeds. Mostly good, I would imagine. But there is another gate, one made famous by the great poet Dante in his Divine Comedy. And what should greet you upon standing before this entryway into the Inferno? No, not some huge beast or ghastly figure. Something far worse. An inscription. Abandon hope, all ye who enter. Now you might be thinking, Joe, you're doing it again. You're being awfully dramatic here. How is an inscription worse than a huge hulking beast? Well, dear listeners, because we can comprehend a beast. We can come to grips with a tangible destruction. But I'm not sure that most people can actually envision what a world with truly no hope is like. Although I'm sure there are some of you out there who can. In this week's episode, we're introduced to a man named Karl Lancer in the time of World War II. As adults, we know that war is a complex subject. But there has always been a part of the ethos of man that has recognized the importance of preserving humanity, especially in times of war. Something that our Rod Serling knew all too well, as a paratrooper for the United States Army during World War II. In this episode, our protagonist finds himself on a cruise aboard the ship the Queen of Glasgow, populated by all types of lovely people. Men, women, and children. Lancer can't seem to shake this feeling that something is about to happen, something terrible. But he can't quite put all of the pieces of the puzzle together until it's too late. The Queen of Glasgow has sailed right into the crosshairs of a German submarine, piloted by a man who doesn't believe in silly things like souls, honor, and the screams of children. But there's a twist of fate at play here. You see, the man behind the orders to sink the Queen of Glasgow is none other than the same man who is trying to warn the people on board the ship, Karl Lancer. Or should I say, Captain Lancer of the German forces. And since that fateful day when he sunk the Queen of Glasgow, Lancer will have to bear witness to his atrocity, to be a part of their fears, screams, and final moments. As the Karl Lancer aboard the Glasgow abandons ship, the one aboard the submarine is left to abandon all hope. Judgment Night is directed by John Brom, teleplay by Rod Serling, and it originally aired on December 4th, 1959. As for our cast, Meyer carries the bulk of the weight in the episode as Captain Karl Lancer, but the entire cast does a particularly wonderful job of maintaining this sense of both distance and somehow familiarity. In other words, it's clear that they don't know Lancer, but there's this kind of fraternal care that makes it quite difficult to watch them as the ship is being attacked, and it finally sinks. It's an absolutely wonderful cast. As for our tidbits, in Grams Jr.'s Unlocking the Door, there's a really interesting quotation from Serling about where he got the idea for this episode. Serling states, "I got it while listening to a sermon on the hereafter. I've never been able to stomach a concept of hell, at least the Dante version. It struck me that purgatory can be given a modern dress, which is what happened in this show." This purgatory comment is fascinating. We know that Serling was an incredibly well-read man, so his bringing up of Dante and purgatory is not a throwaway line. Furthermore, for anyone who has watched the Twilight Zone series, you know that hell and the devil come up quite a few times. In fact, it wasn't all that long ago that we were talking about Cadwallader, or the devil, in Escape Clause. I bring this up because it makes this line about purgatory all the more intriguing for our conversation. Serling would have known that the purpose of purgatory in the Roman Catholic tradition, even if only through his reading of Dante, is the expiation or the removal of sins in preparation for admission to heaven. Now, I've written about Dante before and studied the Divine Comedy. But man, I never would have thought of this episode as a kind of purgatory. That's something that I'll have more to say about a little later. As for my initial thoughts on the episode, no surprise here, I love this episode. But I'm going to bring up something specific about it that I like more than others. Today, our films and streaming television tends to do a rather lackluster job of sustaining suspense. And one of the greatest movies to do this was the original Alien film. Now, don't get me wrong, I love me some Aliens with Bill Paxton, Sigourney Weaver, and Michael Biehn. You know, game over, man, game over! I love it. It's a huge thrill ride. But the original Alien was a masterclass in sustained suspense. And I feel like this episode does a great job of that as well. I also think this is one of those episodes that the more you reflect on it, the more you enjoy it. You find more philosophical and ethical concerns and layers to grapple with. So, speaking of which, let's go ahead and start to grapple with some of those philosophical and ethical concerns. Question 1. Is this a fitting judgment for Captain Lancer? This is one of those questions that seems easy on the surface, but when you dive into it, it's a lot more complex than that. Judgment Night's recurring nightmare of torment is far from original in its core concept of damnation. We as a species have a long history of recording ways that we envision punishment that extend beyond our temporal norms. Let's revisit some examples, and by the end, we should be better equipped to answer the question. As I was thinking about some of the texts and stories over the years that I've taught before involving great damnation, there were two that immediately came to my mind, but they're not the only ones. Hesiod's The Theogony and the Story of Prometheus, and Dante's Inferno. Now, I've also taught John Milton's Paradise Lost as well a few times, but I'm going to hold on to that one for a future episode. Let's revisit Hesiod's Theogony and remind ourselves of the story of Prometheus. Prometheus's torment is one that tends to stay in our minds when we first read about it. It's so specific and filled with interesting symbolism. Every day an eagle, an often cited emblem of Zeus, visits Prometheus, who is chained to a rock, and the eagle eats the god's liver. Now, if you think that's pretty terrible, just wait. There's more. Every night Prometheus's liver grows back, and the same thing happens the next day. Well, what did Prometheus do that was so terrible? He stole fire from Mount Olympus and gave it to us, mere mortals. There are two interesting parts to this punishment. First, you have the physical pain of the event, and yes, that definitely sounds like it would hurt. However, and I think this is probably worse, there's the psychological torment of knowing that it will never end. That the last time the eagle came is not the last time that the eagle will come. Oftentimes, people read about Prometheus's punishment and immediately feel a sense of pity for him. After all, he is being punished for us, for our benefit. And so he takes his place as a kind of messianic figure of sorts. But if you feel terrible, don't fret. In some versions of the myth, Prometheus is eventually set free by Heracles or Hercules. So, no worries. I'm sure he's fine. It's pretty easy to root for Prometheus, even though he was technically wrong. He did steal something that wasn't his. But because we believe in justice as well, we're often willing to overlook the wrong that is done if there's a greater sense of good at the other side. But what happens when we feel that the individual deserves their suffering? Is there a point where condemning someone to suffer becomes pointless. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that there isn't a point to punishment. There is. I guess what I'm asking is there a point at which suffering, in the name of justice even, simply becomes the enjoyment of suffering? And is that good for us as a species? Well, on that happy note, let's turn to Dante's Inferno to get even a bit deeper into this conversation. Pop culturally speaking, most people seem to be at least somewhat acquainted with Dante's Inferno, or Hell from his Divine Comedy. However, for those of you who have still not read it because you think, well, it's pretty straightforward, right? People are in hell. No, it's really not that straightforward. Hell in Dante's world is actually quite complex. Take Capaneus for a moment, one of the 7 champions who made war against Thebes. Capaneus was so arrogant, he stood against the wall of Thebes and proclaimed that not even Zeus himself could stop him. Well, if you know your Greek mythology at all, or are even somewhat familiar with it, you already know that this isn't going to end well. He ends up with a lightning bolt in his ear. When we find Capaneus in Dante's Hell in Canto 14, verse 51, we see a man who is being rained down upon with fire. But Capaneus doesn't care about the fire. You see, he refuses to give his punisher the satisfaction of seeing him in pain. Now that is some commitment. Let's take a quick look at his section in the Inferno. Thus was descending the eternal heat, whereby the sand was set on fire like tinder beneath the steel, for doubling of the dole. Without repose forever was the dance of miserable hands, now there, now here, shaking away from off them the fresh gleeds. Master, began I, thou who overcomest all things except the demons dire that issued against us at the entrance of the gate. Who is that mighty one who seems to heed not the fire, and lieth lowering and disdainful, so that the rain seems not to ripen him? And he himself, who had become aware that I was questioning my guide about him, cried, Such as I was living am I dead. If Jove should weary out his smith, from whom he seized in anger the sharp thunderbolt, wherewith upon the last day I was smitten, and if he wearied out by turns the others in Mongibello at the swarthy forge, vociferating, Help, good Vulcan, help! Even as he did there at the fight of Phlegra, and shot his bolts at me with all his might, he would not have thereby a joyous vengeance. Then did my leader speak with such great force that I had never heard him speak so loud. O Capaneus, in that is not extinguished thine arrogance. Thou punished art the more. Not any torment saving thine own rage would be unto thy fury pain complete. Oh, come on. How can you not love this stuff? Oh, really, that's fantastic. Capaneus doesn't even realize at this point how much his own arrogance is making his suffering worse. Aren't we all guilty of that sometimes? I've been in a few fiery rainstorms of my own making. You know what? I'll just leave it at that for now. To bring this all back to our episode in question, Lancer is actually an interesting kind of Capaneus. He doesn't believe that by, bearing his suffering, he's bringing war upon God. But Lancer is a supremely arrogant man. He does laugh at Muller's thoughts that what they're doing is damning their very souls. And although the German sub-captain is visibly shaken by the end of his talk with Muller, it's too late. The deed is done. He has cemented a place for himself in the hell portion of the Twilight Zone. A truly horrible place. So is this a fitting judgment for Lancer? The secular part of me says yes. But as for the theological or ethereal arguments, I don't know. I'll leave that to others to decide. I'll simply add that Serling's comment that I referenced in the tidbits section indicates that even he might believe that there is room for grace and forgiveness for Lancer. If this scenario is indeed purgatory and not hell, there will be a time when Lancer's punishment will end, after he has paid for his sins. And if we take this notion of purgatory to its end, there's even a possibility that Lancer will go to heaven. Now, I know that this probably won't sit well with many of you, maybe even all of you, and feel free to share your thoughts about it. I'll simply say, Serling's thoughts here are coming from a place of a strong belief in forgiveness and mercy, and you might disagree with his assessment, or mine, but I think you have to respect where they're coming from. Question 2. The scene that we get at the end of the episode between Lancer and Muller, is that part of the moment that is constantly relived, and is Muller actually there with Lancer? I've thought about this one for a bit. It seems to me that the scene with Muller is a part of the entire repeated scene, that Lancer relives the moment when one of his men explains that what they're doing is wrong and that they're damning themselves. Despite John Lilly's often quoted saying that all is fair in love and war, that's simply not the case, nor should it be. You can clearly see the dread on Lancer's face at the end of the exchange between the two men. He does experience this sudden realization that what he has done can have existential consequences beyond his earthly existence. Let's expand our thoughts here and include Muller into our conversation. I'm going to read the lines from a part of the exchange between Lancer and Muller, having to do with being damned in the eyes of God. It begins with Lancer asking the following. So what if we are damned? What will happen then? To this, Muller responds, I've had dreams about it. Perhaps there is a special kind of hell for people like us. Perhaps to be damned is to have a fate like those people on that ship. To suffer as they suffered, and to die as they die. You can clearly hear Dante in these lines, this idea that your punishment connects with what you've done in some meaningful way. You also have this connection to revelation through prophetic dreaming, which is also in Dante as well, and it's exactly what's happening here. Muller is, in fact, revealing to Lancer what is going to happen to him. Does it help us answer if Muller is a part of all of this? Well, in some ways, yes. Muller continually includes himself in this discussion. Us, we, etc. It's clear that he believes that he will be judged and punished accordingly. However, we don't see Muller on the Queen of Glasgow, or on his own version of that ship. But it could be that Muller's punishment is to always be connected with Lancer, to always have to be on the sub with Lancer and constantly destroying the Queen of Glasgow, to not die 1,000,000 times, as he says to Lancer, but to live 1,000,000 times, to have to bear witness to his decision to follow these orders. This notion of just following orders will come up again in the episode of Death's Head Revisited. Now that to me would certainly count as a kind of hell, and Muller himself seems to accept his fate. So I do think that Muller is there, and he is a part of this whole nightmare. Where did you find your moment of awe? Something that moved you or inspired you to think beyond the surface? A moment of awe that I experienced has to do with something that I see us struggle with a lot in today's culture, a kind of war. In the exchange between Lancer and Muller, when Muller starts to question their having killed the people on the Queen of Glasgow without warning them, Lancer responds, "You have sentiment, Muller, but no brains." Is Lancer's logic right at this point in the conversation? If they had warned the people aboard the Queen, a message would have likely been sent out to someone for help. The position of Lancer's sub would have been discovered, and that would have placed them in peril. It doesn't make sense to warn them in terms of pure logic and war. Most of our existence is probably best governed by logic and facts, But there are times when the heart and the soul try to steer us toward a different kind of truth. A truth that is valued not on logical merit, but on its merit to the human condition. It's not always easy to heed these warnings and ignore logic, but I do believe that sometimes we have to. I've never been in combat, and I don't want to pretend to understand how such decisions are made. But Rod Serling was in combat. He did see these moments. And if one looks closely enough, one can see Serling's thoughts come through in the Twilight Zone episodes that deal with war. And I think more times than not, Serling is trying to tell us there's a place for the heart and soul at the table when discussing matters of life, death, good and evil. And that we should always find time to at least listen to what they have to say. As for my rating, this episode is pretty horrific. It's a haunting reminder that our actions have consequences, and the thought of reliving something over and over again is terrifying. I've always found this episode to be both jarring and enveloping. This is most definitely an upper-lower tier episode for me. I can watch it over and over and get placed into a kind of trance for about 30 minutes after it's ended. Just thinking about it. Pretty amazing. Next time we'll be discussing And When the Sky Was Opened, and here are your questions to consider as you watch. As always, beware of potential spoilers. Question 1. We may not actually disappear, but do we as humans have a kind of phenomenon where we feel as though we've been removed from the world? Question 2. We now have so many movies and shows that talk about time and multiverses. Does our knowledge today impact how we look at the way Rod Serling handled it in this episode? And what are your moments of awe? Well, hopefully that episode went well and you won't judge me too harshly if it was not up to standards. I suppose a kind of hell would be me redoing the same episode over and over again and just bearing witness to my own incompetence and inability to find the right words to express my thoughts. Unfortunately, that happens more often than I would like to admit. But hopefully I entertained you all a little bit and made you think a little bit in relation to the Twilight Zone. Now, a quick announcement. You might have noticed that I'm no longer including my little green screen openings with the main episodes. After listening to some sage advice and reflecting on it myself, it became clear that it wasn't really functioning as I intended. It ended up becoming like listening to two different introductions, so I'll be keeping those separate from now on. Just like myself, this show is a work in progress, but I appreciate all of you who reach out with kind words and constructive feedback. Thank you. For some exciting news, the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation has announced a tentative date for the unveiling of the Rod Serling statue in Recreation Park in Binghamton, New York, which is only a hop, skip, and a jump away from me in Albany. The tentative date is May 18th. And I believe the dates for Serling Fest have also been announced as August 16th through the 18th in Binghamton, New York. I'm definitely going to try to make my way to both of those. It would be great if I could meet some of you or just meet, people who love Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone. It's always fun for me to have these kind of face-to-face personal conversations. I may even try to bring some of my podcasting show equipment to see if I can kind of, put something together while I'm there. Now, if as you're cleaning your car seats or your sofa cushions, you happen to find some loose change, head over to rodserling.com. That's the official website for the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation. They could still use some help to pay for shipping, the base of the statue, and other incidentals. It's a great organization. I do have a few comments to highlight from YouTube. Steven commented on the Escape Clause episode, "Keep up the great work." Thanks, Steven. I appreciate the kind words, and I'm continually working on getting better at this from all directions. The writing, the production, the connection with the audience. These positive words really help keep me motivated to work and improve. Matt Campbell commented on the Walking Distance episode, "Great insight. Keep working on your craft. But main thing is, you're on the exact right path. Keep doing what you're doing." Matt, thank you, friend. Sometimes we throw out these kind little phrases, and when we make them, we don't think much of it. But sometimes the person on the receiving end really needed to hear that little bit of positivity in that moment. So thank you. And I absolutely will keep working on the craft. My students are sometimes shocked when I tell them, look, I've never written a perfect paper, so I don't expect perfect papers from you. But work hard and say something that you believe might be valuable to the world. That's what I hope to be doing here. I hope that I can provide some moments of reflection for all of us. Let me say thank you to all of you who are listening. I really hope that we would be able to build a solid, good, positive community of people who just love the Twilight Zone and love to talk about the Twilight Zone and about life, important things. And I think we're starting to build it. But that's not because of me. That's actually because of all of you. Because of the way that we talk to each other, the way that we respect each other, the way that we forgive when I say something that doesn't quite work out right, let's say. I have to have my faith in you that you'll take what I'm saying in good faith. So I thank you for that. Head over to thekeyofImagination.com to continue our conversation. You can rate this episode, learn more about me, watch previous episodes of the show, and check out my Curios page, which I will finish someday. If you enjoyed the show, I ask that you please take a moment and do one of the following to help build our community. Rate the show, review the podcast, leave comments, thumbs up, all of the usual algorithmic gymnastiques that will help get the show in front of more people and help us build our community of Twilight Zone fans. However, even if you do none of that, and you absolutely hated every minute of this, I'm still going to thank you for spending some time with me. Until next time, remember, all doors are open to those who possess the key of imagination.